50 years ago today, Margaret Thatcher sent shockwaves through politics when she ousted Edward Heath to become leader of the Conservative Party. She was to remain in charge for 15 years, 11 of them as Prime Minister. Her government was a highly radical one, and its record in power is still hotly debated, not least in Scotland. This evening, we reflected on Mrs Thatcher's legacy with the political commentator Bernard Ponsonby. So Margaret Thatcher, the new Conservative leader at the time, just how radical a figure was she, Bernard?
I think there are two great radical prime ministers of the post-war period who have enduring legacies. The first was Clement Attlee and that Labour government from 1945, because what that did was that it entrenched the welfare state and the National Health Service in particular, and no one would ever challenge that orthodoxy. The election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, very, very radical, because she changed the industrial landscape, she changed the housing landscape, she deregulated markets, she was a force for privatisation, and therefore both she and Attlee, one Labour, one Conservative, have enduring legacies.
Well, let's touch on the housing. That's one of our enduring ones as well. The sale of council houses. How big an impact did that have?
Well, in 1979, the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland rented from a local authority or from a housing association or from the Scottish Special Housing Association as was. So over 50% of the tenure was in the public sector. Fewer than a third of housing was actually in private hands. By the time that she was ejected from Downing Street in 1990, treachery with a smile, I recall her saying, then the housing tenure in Scotland had completely changed. Over half were in owner occupation. The interesting thing was that she spied that working class people aspired to own their own home, and they decided to do that in their droves. What they didn't do, though, was vote for her.
And of course there's a legacy, because the houses weren't replaced.
They were not replaced, and to a certain extent, you can't blame her entirely for the social housing crisis that we have today, because successive governments at Holyrood have not made the investment that is necessary. But if you flog off hundreds of thousands of houses in the public sector and you don't replace them, you're going to have a crisis somewhere down the line. So one of her legacies is that the crisis that you have in social housing, I do believe, you can go back to that point when council houses were sold off.
And also a huge impact on industrial relations and changing the kind of culture of the 70s.
Yeah, you have to remember that the number of days lost through strikes in the 70s was phenomenal. The Conservative government fell in 1974. Ted Heath asked the question at the February 74 general election, who governs Britain? The trade unions or the democratically elected government, and Heath lost. But also as a result of industrial unrest during the winter of discontent, the Callaghan government fell as a consequence of industrial unrest. And she was determined to cut the unions down to size. And the Tebbit legislation, the employment legislation of the early 1980s, it did away with things like the closed shop, which meant that you had to belong to a trade union or you couldn't get a job. Secondary picketing was outlawed. Sympathy strikes were outlawed. And of course, it became mandatory for ballots before industrial action could take place. And the interesting thing is that the broad infrastructure of the Tebbit legislation, as it applies in industrial relations, has never actually been repealed by a Labour government. So from that point of view, again, there is a legacy which is felt to this day.
We live in a very different Scotland now than when Margaret Thatcher took over the Conservative Party. But she did have an impact in the Constitution as well, didn't she?
Yes, I mean, you have to remember that after Winnie Ewing won that famous by-election in Hamilton way back in November of 1967, in 1968, Ted Heath had the famous Declaration of Perth, where he pledged the Tories to back what was then called a Scottish Assembly. Labour legislated not once but twice for an assembly in the 1970s, and when it fell because of the 40% rule after the referendum on the 1st of March 1979, Alec Douglas-Hume, former Perthshire MP, former Conservative Prime Minister, said, vote down Labour's assembly and the Conservatives will put a better one in place. It didn't happen because by 1979, Mrs. Thatcher had completely and utterly jettisoned any support from the Conservative side for a Scottish Assembly. And of course, it meant that for 18 years, devolution was effectively delayed, because devolution was never going to be delivered on the Conservatives' watch, and it most certainly was never going to be delivered on her watch.
So what's her legacy been for the Conservative Party, particularly in British politics generally, now?
I think that there are some people who would say that the current Conservative Party lack any ideological anchors, and that they've forgot the lessons of Thatcherism. It has to be said, of course, that culturally she was detested in Scotland, absolutely detested in Scotland. She was the bête noire of the left, and indeed some people within the Conservative Party had real problems with the way in which entire industries were allowed to die and entire communities were allowed to go to the wall, and there wasn't any intervention. But some people believe that people like Kemi Badenoch have to go back to Thatcherite principles. I mean, some of the stuff during lockdown, for example, John, that the Johnson government were pursuing, furlough, for example. Furlough was the kind of state intervention with eye-watering price tags, the kind of stuff that she actually detested and hated. I think quite a lot of what Conservative governments have done in recent times, you certainly couldn't characterise as Thatcherite. Help with energy bills, for example. Thatcher would have completely and utterly opposed that.
Fascinating to look back. Bernard, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.